Welcome, everybody, to our online event with the Asian Adoptees of Canada for Birth, Family Search, and Reunion. We're so pleased to welcome each of you from across Canada, the US, and truly around the world. My name is Leah Kim Brighton, and I'm the president of the Asian Adoptees of Canada, and I'll be your moderator today. So joining us from the board is also Shelley. I don't know, Shelley, if you want to take a moment to say hello and do a bit of a wave so folks can see you on the grid.
Hi,
Shelley.
everyone.
Shelley is fantastic. She's our Director of Social Media and Engagement. And I'm not sure if Colin has yet joined us, but he is our VP of Engineering and Technology. So he has made our beautiful website, which I'm incredibly thankful for. You're welcome, as mentioned, to put on your cameras if you like. It's always nice for folks to see who else is here. And as a note for Canada, this panel that you're joining today is the first of its kind. It's where we have such a diversity of adoptees sharing their experiences about birth family, about birth search, and possibly about reunion as well. So if you've ever wondered and joined a lot of these events and wondered how you can get the most out of your time here for retention, for engagement and interest, it really is up to you. So there's lots of research that shows that kind of retention and interest for events can go up to 60%, increase by 60%, just by you kind of engaging the chat, asking questions, using emojis, whatever you like. Personally, I'm a big fan of emojis, but I know that the research clearly indicates that that's a really great way for you to really gain as much as you can from this afternoon. So throughout the afternoon, please feel free to use the chat, ask any questions you have or comments, etc. Shelley, who you just met, she will be collating all your questions into a Google Doc for us, and we'll return to them during the Q&A portion. So again, please feel free to use the chat, ask your comments, and if you would like, also during the Q&A, you'll have a chance to raise your hand and ask your question live as well as an option if you would like. So yeah, I wanted to ask, for you, how many of you like, say, watching movies, maybe like Netflix or reading books, etc.? I'm guessing most people do. You could nod, put a yes in the chat. And how many of you like stories that have like happily ever after, right? Like a happy ending, right? The Superman saves the day, Bond gets the bad guy, Cinderella marries Prince Charming. It's nice and it's predictable. It's partly why Pixar movies are so popular. And you always know that there will be like a happy ending. And for adoptees, we have a similar story, a singular similar story that is told for the Hollywood narrative of adoptees. And it is so pervasive, but it is also very limiting. So there's often this story, right? A child is born, becomes an orphan, gets adopted, and lives happily ever after. Like Superman or maybe Harry Potter, and that's it. Or on rare occasions, there's the other version. A child is born, becomes an orphan, gets adopted, does a birth search, reunites with their birth family, and then lives happily ever after. This is the story that we saw in Lion. But the reality is, there isn't just one story or one path to that happily ever after. Hollywood, though, and that narrative that is so loud, only shows that this is the story that adoptees should aspire to, should be grateful for, and should ignore all other variations. But that's absurd, right? That'd be like saying there's only one favorite color that you should have, or one favorite restaurant, or one favorite food. So if you have a favorite food, you can let me know. You can write in the chat. I personally am a big fan of watermelon. And the truth is that there are so many different stories that all of us have. And some of us do fall within that Hollywood narrative. But the vast majority of us have a very different path to our histories and our futures. And the Hollywood narrative sometimes is false. So for example, right, another story that Hollywood likes to perpetuate is like the American dream, right? Needing to go to, say, an Ivy League university or school in order to have success in your career in life. And so Jack Ma, who's the founder of Alibaba, was told this, and he tried very hard to follow it. In fact, he revealed later that he was rejected from Harvard 10 times until he finally gave up. He then applied to other jobs, dozens of other jobs, and was actually rejected from KFC. And if the story had stopped there, it may have looked like Hollywood's narrative was right. You did have to go to university, some Ivy League school, in order to have a successful life. But if you fast forward, he later founded Alibaba, which is an international giant with an estimated value of $206.2 billion. And maybe you felt like that. Maybe back in undergrad, maybe you had a midterm or a final that you felt was like the biggest barrier in your life, and that if you failed it, it would be the end of the world. But likely, if you fast forward, now you're probably working, and you can likely barely even remember the millions of exams that you did. And so Hollywood likes to tell us like the one story to follow for glory, but it fails to tell the other tales and the wins in your sails that can take you to far different places. And another Hollywood narrative that likes to focus on a singular story are the tech giants, right? Steve Jobs was the poster boy for that. He founded Apple with obviously Steve Wozniak, and they were the tech darlings. And that was, he was the poster boy until he wasn't. And he was actually like asked to leave his company. The Hollywood narrative for the tech giants doesn't cover that. And if the story had stopped there, what a loss it would have been, right? How much more we'd have lost for like context and nuance for many different ways that a story can unfold. And the actual story for Steve Jobs was that he returned to Apple many years later and created the company in the form that we know it today as the giant. And his legacy lives on even 10 years after his death. So maybe you felt like that, right? Have you ever felt like that? Feeling that you had a milestone that you had to achieve, you achieved the goal that maybe you were supposed to. Maybe that was like your driver's license, right? Maybe that was learning a new sport or a new skill. Maybe that was like taking a big trip. You can let me know, whatever that might have been. And then maybe after you achieved it, you realize that there was so much more after that initial goal. And sometimes doing a birth search can feel like that. The goal is to find your birth family and realizing that there's so much more after that, beyond whatever that initial goal may be. And so these are the stories, right, that Hollywood likes to tell us, that this is it. This is the final thing that you should be happy for, or that you should be grateful for, or that you should feel complete about. But the story that Hollywood tells us is missing so much. So this is my last note, right? I don't know if any of you, personally, I have a sweet tooth. I like chocolate chip cookies. I don't know if any of you have ever had chocolate chip cookies. You can let me know. But did you know the chocolate chip cookies, even though there's a specific story and script that you're supposed to follow, they were actually invented by accident. So in 1938, Ruth Wakefield would usually follow step-by-step instructions, right, on how to make cookies with chocolate. And usually she would melt the chocolate in the batter, and then they would melt and then be distributed in whatever cookie. She was running late, so there was a variation in whatever story or script, the step-by-step plan that you're supposed to follow. And what happened was she just dumped the chocolate chips in, baked them, and what came out was what we know today as chocolate chip cookies, as in like there's specific chunks in those cookies. So what's important is that even if your story doesn't follow the specific script that Hollywood or whatever narrative tells you it should follow, there can often be surprises that are much better than whatever you might have anticipated. That's helpful to know. So part of why the conversation today around birth search and reunion, I feel is so important is because it highlights the many different ways that our stories unfold. Far outside of what Hollywood likes to tell us, there are so many different variations for our journeys. And as adoptees, our stories are unique, with more diversity in them than there are likely stars in the sky. And today, I'm so pleased for you to hear from our three panelists, each from different countries and each with their own unique story and journey to share. And so first, you can see Charlotte. Charlotte, maybe you can wave so folks can see where you are in the tiles. Charlotte is a 29-year-old Chinese-American, transracial, and transnational adoptee. She currently lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she was adopted from Zhejiang City in the province of China. In 1995, she grew up in the greater Boston area with her two moms and younger sister adopted also from another province. In 2011, along with Lainey Allison, Charlotte co-founded China's Children International, CCI, and was one of the first international nonprofits ran by and for Chinese adoptees. In the summer of 2016, she was reunited with her biological parents and three biological siblings. Although she has yet to return to China to visit, she keeps in touch with her family through WeChat. Charlotte is excited to talk about her experiences conducting a birth search, and as well as her own thoughts on searching for biological relatives in mainland China. And as a note, we're especially thankful for Charlotte for joining us today because she actually has COVID, but she wanted to make sure that she was able to still connect answer questions, etc. So we've adjusted the format slightly to accommodate for Charlotte. So thank you so much, Charlotte, for being here. Daniel Moon is another adoptee. He was adopted as an infant from South Korea in the early 90s. And recently, as of last year in 2023, he entered reunion with his birth mother and half-sister after a fairly short but frenzied birth family search. He feels fortunate to have benefited from existing information and the network that Korean adoptees before him have done. Dan feels driven to contribute what he can to future adoptees considering their own birth family searches. He's humbled but grateful to be part of this panel and to share his voice and story. And lastly, we have Steve Mark. So Steve was adopted from Vietnam in April of 1995. He was part of Operation Baby Lift, which was an historic operation at the time, and grew up in Surrey, BC. He now resides in Victoria on the island. His mom was very involved and founded the Adopted Families Association of BC, now called the Belonging Network. Growing up, he sat on many panels regarding adoption, and he has had the opportunity to visit both his birth country once during university and more recently with his family in 2023. He's hoping to make it back to Vietnam in 2025 in celebration of Operation Baby Lift for the 50th anniversary. Very briefly, for myself, I am also an adoptee. I was adopted from Korea. I grew up in the orphanage until I was 4.5. I have my master's in speech language pathology and first practiced as a speech language pathologist in Vancouver, then as a policy advisor in the federal government, and now I work as an executive communication coach in Toronto. I founded Canada's first organization for adoptees and led by adoptees, and I reunited with my birth family in 2007, and at that time, I discovered I was the 7th daughter in my birth family. So that is a brief overview for the folks who are joining us today, and I did want to have a chance as far as for brief schedule, kind of an outline for yourself. We'll have each of the panels introduce themselves, and then we'll have a specific Q&A just for Charlotte so that she can answer questions that folks might have specifically for China, and then we will let Charlotte go to bed. Then we will continue the panel, and you'll be able to ask additional questions for both Steve and Dan. So throughout all of the this afternoon, please feel free to use the chat. Again, as mentioned, during the open Q&A section, after we get through the questions that were submitted online, you'll have a chance to raise your hand and also ask your questions live. So to that, Charlotte, would you like to kind of share a little bit about yourself as far as an intro, and then we can maybe have a Q&A with you.
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Cotter. As Leah mentioned, I am a Chinese-American, transracial, and transnational adoptee. I'm really excited to be a part of the panel. So many thanks to Leah and to Asian Adoptees of Canada, as well as Shelley, and to my fellow panelists, Daniel and Steve. And again, I'm sorry I can't. I do have COVID, which I guess is, you know, the why Zoom is here, or not why Zoom is here, but it's one of the upsides of having a virtual event. So I'm glad I could still, be here for what I can. And I'm sorry I can't be here 100%. But I think there'll be a way to kind of continue the discussion later on as well. But yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out here. And also say that I guess the other thing that I always want to say before is this is just my own personal story, and I'm happy to share my own experiences, but it just is reflective of my own, and as Leah mentioned, there are as many stories and as many kind of experiences that all these all adoptees have as there are adoptees. So this is just one, and I'm happy I can share my story today. As let me see, is there anything else I could add to my intro there? Not much. Again, I grew up in the Boston, Massachusetts area. So I'm located in the greater Boston area. I was adopted from Zhenjiang City in Jiangsu province. And I think it'll go into a little bit more depth with the questions. But I conducted a birth parent search in summer of 2016. Both through social media before I headed out to China, and then I did. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I was able to meet them in person on the ground in Zhenjiang, and in where I found out that they actually are from, in Huai'an, which is a city about 2 hours north of that. And I'm happy to talk about my experience searching, kind of what led to my decision to start searching, my experience with sort of the peculiarities or the particularities of searching in mainland China, where a lot of us, not obviously not all of us, everybody's story is different, but a lot of us might not have kind of the official route to, just kind of asking, the agency. A lot of agencies don't have the information or the social welfare institutes. And so I'm happy to talk about what the social media search was like, and working with, I worked eventually with some journalists, local journalists in the area, and what it's like to work with the media, some pros and cons of that, and some considerations that I wish sort of I had thought of before I went into that. And then kind of what the complexities of union, and which is really something that I hadn't thought too much about before searching. I wish I had, but I think in a lot of ways it opened as many questions as it answered. And I think sorry, now I'm going on and on, but yeah, I think there are a lot of complexities in terms of like, well, now that I found them, what does it mean to have to be an adult adoptee in a relationship with and to have a relationship with a biological family. So I am definitely looking forward to chatting with that with the panelists. And again, yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Maybe, Charlotte, what I find kind of helpful for lots of folks is they often wonder, what prompted you to start your birth search? Was there something in particular
Sure.
you see that really made you want to, want to start your search?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry. Yeah. That's a good question. I think for me, I had always been sort of curious about my origins, and sort of what the big question mark around the early part of my story. So what I knew was that I was adopted from the Zhenjiang City Social Welfare Institute in 1995 by my parents. And then I found out that I was found on the steps of a public building, and that I was brought to the Social Welfare Institute by the police. But other than that, I didn't know anything about who my biological parents were, sort of why had I been given up, how did I end up there. So I was really curious about that. I was also curious to find biological relatives if I could, see if they looked like me, possibly get some medical history background if I could. And then just generally, I think I was always sort of interested in China. And I do, appreciate that my parents encouraged me to start learning Chinese early, which was a big factor in why I was able to go and conduct the search on the ground. Although we did work with translators, and I will speak to that a little bit more probably when we talk about the search process. Um, but I think, yeah, it was just sort of a curiosity, a natural curiosity about, these days we see so many people, even non-adoptees, going on 23andMe, or, wanting to know about, ancestry.com. And, it's just only natural for adoptees to be like, where did I come from? Who am I? And so I think that a lot of that was came from that. And then the other thing I will note is that my mom is actually also adoptee, not internationally, but she was adopted domestically. And she had found her biological parents when she was in her 20s. So I think that was a big role model. She was a role model for me in sort of normalizing that and seeing that. And she was a big supporter of understanding that the search was not, did not qualify any kind of, the relationship that I had with her and with the relationship that I had with my family. And so I think, that's really difficult. And so I feel really grateful that I had a family that was really supportive of my search. And so, yeah, it really just came from the sort of curiosity, and also kind of just sort of, I guess, yeah, at the time, the timing was right. I had tickets I was studying in Taiwan in the fall of that year. So I had tickets to Asia. And I wanted to see if anybody else wanted to search. So I actually searched along with a friend who was also a Chinese adoptee, who reached out to me and said she'd be interested in taking on the ground search. So that's how we really got started. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So what I'm hearing is that, you've always had different pieces and knowledge of kind of your story, your origin story that was communicated in your adoption file. And it was like percolating in the background. And I think what's really important is that, you had an adoptive parent or parents who didn't have the kind of communicate either implicitly or explicitly that it was you having to choose. Because I feel like some adoptees can feel like if they do pursue a birth search, there can be a sense of like having to pick between one family or the other. And I think that's really a disservice to adoptees because it's not a choice. It's not choosing one over the other. I think there's what's really important is like the additive nature of recognizing that you can certainly embrace your Canadian or American or whatever, culture, family, community that you're a part of, while also, honoring and still wanting to pursue and explore where you come from, which is, I think, a very innate and human desire that we have. So I think that's really important. And I feel like another point you touched upon is, the importance of community, right? So there was another Chinese adoptee who also did the search with you. And I think that's like so important, and which is a really important reason and, part of the genesis certainly for the Asian Adoptees of Canada and why we have these events. But one thing that I think is really, unique and interesting about kind of your search and for timeline, right? So a lot of it, depending on when adoptees do their birth search, there are, say, different tools or opportunities available. So DNA testing, certainly when I did it, it was really not a viable option just because there weren't enough people who really had submitted their DNA. But you, as far as kind of the timeline for when you commenced your search, you were able to use social media, which is another tool that a lot of people don't consider, and would love for you to maybe kind of share more about what that experience was like, how you went about it, and maybe if other folks were also interested in using social media, et cetera, how they might be able to actually harness the powers of social media in order to do a birth search.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that question, and thanks also for your thoughts. I'll just do a quick follow-up on what Leah said about, my relationship with my family. And I think, even more so, I think after the search, my relationship with my family has gotten even stronger, in being able to talk through these things and to kind of have, they were there for me, and even though they weren't there right next to me physically, they weren't on the trip with me, but I think just being able to go through this as a family and has just brought us a lot closer together. But yeah, on the topic of social media, yeah, so at the time there weren't a lot of well, there wasn't like sort of like one main strategy that a lot of Chinese adoptees were there wasn't like a set kind of structure that Chinese adoptees were following. It's like, here's what you do to find your birth parents. So there were a lot of kind of different ways that people were going about it. I knew that some Chinese adoptees had gone in person to their local social welfare institutes or to where they were found and put up posters, and trying to connect with people that way. I know that another another avenue that people were trying was to go on national television in China. I know a friend who did that, and try to get an interview that way and to try to get visibility. And so I think there was like a lot of sort of, uncertainty as to and kind of, what to do, and how to go about the search. And I know, and so and social media also was one of the options out there. And I think it had been used by a couple of Chinese adoptees beforehand, before we had tried it. And so because we started our search before we went on the ground in China, before we even got there, we thought that that was the best option for us, to start with social media. And so what we did was we made a poster, that basically had all the information that we had, which is really not that much. Excuse me. But so it was like I had half and then my friend had a half. And we listed where, what we know about our birth dates and where we were found, when we were adopted, if we had any like baby pictures of the time. And then we made like a special email account, or I think it was at the time it was WeChat, which is, I don't think it was like QQ and WeChat, WeChat is still a big social media platform. In fact, that's how I keep in touch with my biological family right now. But so we made like a specific account for people to contact if they had any information. And then we just shared that on Weibo, which is like a microblogging platform in China. And we also shared it on, I think, like WeChat stories or something. And we had help, because I had studied abroad in China a number of times before. So I had some of my friends help me like like, I don't know really know how it like works, but like they helped like share it and kind of like tag like local media. And I think that was one way that it kind of got around. And my friend, she had a picture of her foster family. So she was also looking for a foster family that she had lived with for 2 years. And so she had a picture of them, but she had no information about them. Anyway, that's not my story to tell, but she did end up finding them within 24 hours, honestly, of it being posted, which is honestly really crazy. So that's like, the way the internet works. Um, but for me, what happened was I didn't find them through that post. What happened was I was connected to a journalist in the area. Actually, I was connected with a lot of journalists. It was kind of a crazy situation because I had a lot of people reaching out to me, which is like, good because I did want people to help me. And I think that was one of the things that social media did bring, was that I brought a lot of local contacts in the area. But it can be kind of overwhelming to sort of field, people reaching out to you, like, are their intentions good or intentions not good? I mean, not that I'm necessarily like saying AJ, it's just like you have to be careful about these things, especially if you put it out there on the internet. Um, and of the people that were reaching out to us, one of them happened to be a local media outlet. And what she ended up doing, well, the crazy thing is, on my end, what I ended up seeing was that after we posted it, I was messaging back with forth with her along with along with a lot of others. So it was like, at the time it was kind of a messy, but now I can sort of tell it more literally. Um, but she ended up messaging me and saying, "We found your birth parents. Do you want to like they want to call you right now?" And I was like, how, what? So that was sort of crazy. But what she did um, was that she ended up going to the Social Welfare Institute and taking a look at my file. Um, and in the file, there was a note. So I was left with a note which had my birthday and time on it. And on the back of the note, there was like a piece of paper or something, and somebody had scribbled a vaccination record. Or like somebody had been like, baby had been vaccinated at this hospital or whatnot. And then so she went to the hospital and she was like, well, if she was vaccinated there, maybe she was also born there. And somehow, I don't even know. That's like whatever, she got access to the records. That's like whatever. I have no idea how she did that. But so she looked through the records and of that hospital, and she looked at who gave birth at that specific date and time. And there was still a record there of somebody's name and their home address. And so she was like, well, it's 20 some odd years later, but maybe they still live there. And so she went to their address um, out in Guayan, which is the city like kind of 2 or 3 hours away. Um, and my second oldest biological sibling happened to be home. And so she didn't like know, the reporter didn't really know how to like broach the topic, but then the sister sort of like sensed why she was there, and she was like, are you here about the child that our family sent away? Which is pretty crazy. And so then they called the parents back. The parents were working during the day, so they weren't there, but then they came back and said this facts seemed to like match up. And so that's when she had them on the phone for me. What I was seeing on the other end was, we found your biological family. They want to talk to you right now, which is honestly really wild. And again, it's crazy, just kind of like these like pieces that of like sheer luck that kind of happen to come together, of like no control of my own. So obviously I feel really, really lucky to that this worked out, but it just seems like a one in like a bajillion chance. And so yeah, that's how I ended up connecting with them for the first time. And sorry, that goes beyond your question, but
No, I mean, I think that's so insightful and so helpful for people to hear. Kind of what you ended on as far as, sometimes the sense that we can have is that a birth search can be like an impossibility, right? Like it's on the other side of the world, and that there are records that may or may not be more or less accurate. And, what you really highlighted in your experience is that there are so many different avenues that this can unfold. And importantly, you use social media kind of as the initial kind of inception. And it wasn't necessarily them seeing your social media post, but what it led to was an awareness in the local, like in your city, like in the local network, the local newspapers, the local reporters, for it to be on their radar, and for then those people then to kind of step in and be kind of boots on the ground and, actually conduct the search locally. So I feel that's helpful because sometimes when people think about using social media, it's, the idea is that your birth family or somebody will see your immediate social media post, but it might be, another degree removed, 1 or 2 or 3 degrees removed from who is actually able to help you. So all of these different pieces, I think, are really helpful and important to recognize that there isn't like one singular option, right? So kind of Dan had mentioned is that in the Korean adoptee, because we've been pursuing birth search for some time, there's a very structured and kind of established system and what that can look like. But for Chinese adoptees, even though it may not be as structured, there are different systems and processes in place that you can use, whether that be social media or local journalists or whatever other network that you are able to establish. And I feel like that's really helpful for people to see and to hear that that's part of an option and avenue available. I'm cognizant of the time, and I was hoping to kind of let you go in about 10 minutes, so at quarter past the hour. So I did want to open it up for folks here. If anybody has a question, they can raise their hand, ask their question maybe directly to Charlotte if you have a specific question in mind. I did see one question here in the chat from Kyung-mi. So maybe we'll start with this question, and then if other folks have a question, they could ask it as well. So this is a different kind of question as far as it's a bit longer. Actually, Kyung-mi, did you want to ask the question directly, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, Leah, please just read it.
Okay. So the question is as follows. It's a bit long. I'm gonna face this way, but I'm still reading it. So let's see. This is for everybody on the panel, right? As the panel became aware of the political machinations and system that were in place to cause adoption in the sending countries, so Vietnam, Korea, and China, how has that knowledge impacted your feelings about about your adopted family, your birth family, and your feelings where things are at your life currently? How have you maybe reconciled the dissonance between your adopted families and benefited from the same systems that were not set up to benefit your birth families? That's a layered question. I know that's quite the question to
No,
pick.
that's a really good one.
I definitely recognize that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'm also interested to hear what my fellow panelists have to say about it. Just kind of picking up really quickly before I answer the question about what Leah said. I think that's a really good point, that it wasn't necessarily social media that allowed me to directly find them, but it was that allowed me to kind of get this local network of people that were helping me. And I think that's something that I would say is one of my suggestions for anybody who's hoping to search in well, I guess I'll say in China because that's what I know, but because I think it's really helpful to have people who are local to the area. Even if, like me, I have some Chinese knowledge of the Chinese language and culture, and I had been there before. But it was really just helpful to have somebody who was a native speaker, who knew the area, who could decipher handwriting when it was hard for me to read it, who could do local dialects. I spent all this time studying. I get there and everybody speaks a local dialect, so I had trouble understanding a lot of people. So I do think that, even if you are fairly comfortable with language, having somebody that you trust for whatever reason, that is knowledgeable about the area is definitely helpful. Sorry, and then to the question, yes, this is such a good question. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about, this sort of larger kind of political scale. And well, I think there are like a lot of dimensions to that. I think from something that I've been learning from joining the adoptee community is to kind of look at these systems a little bit more critically. And especially because I kind of came maybe to adoption with a little bit of like sort of rose-colored glasses, so to say. And to think about, right, like kind of these structures of power of, more kind of third world developing countries, sort of like outsourcing, childcare, to these like, first world, predominantly white, predominantly for Chinese adoptees, I would say predominantly middle to upper class, which is not necessarily true for, you know, all Asian adoptees, but for Chinese adoptees in particular, that was sort of the kind of demographic that was adopting. And I definitely think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how it is difficult to reconcile kind of like, you know, you know, I think it is good to think about and be critical about these systems and like how does it happen that like these things are happening. I don't have like a perfect answer to kind of like, you know, what to say about that, but you know, in China in particular, and I've been interested in this, that's one of the things that I've sort of been studying. I actually was an East Asian Studies major in college, and so I kind of looked a little bit into the one child policy, and kind of how it how to say, like kind of collided in sort of a calamitous fashion with you know, a lot of these notions about traditional notions about having to have a son to carry on the family name, and you know, economic difficulties that a lot of families were facing, and kind of like right, like I guess like physical and or daily life necessities, having to have somebody like a guy, like a son to, you know, work on the farm or whatnot, to do the manual labor and this, that, and the other thing. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. And, you know, I've been thinking, and it's so a little bit hard to kind of, because I definitely see like where that's coming into play with my story in particular, especially because I found that I have 2 older biological sisters, which would make me the third. And then 1 younger biological brother, which who's exactly a year younger than me. So it's very clear that they were trying to have a son. And so, you know, you can see these sort of things that, you know, you're learning about play out in the things that you're finding. But it is kind of hard to kind of reconcile, like, you know, these processes are going on, but, you know, and now that you're seeing them kind of reflected in sort of really shaping the trajectory of your life, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I know, sorry, I don't know if that's necessarily like a satisfying total answer to the question, but I hope I kind of responded to it a little bit.
Yeah, Charlotte, I mean, I think you really touched upon that. The reality is that there are so many different forces that are a part of, you know, all of our adoption histories and narratives, right? You know, China is unique in the sense that, unlike Korea and Vietnam, you know, the genesis of like the scale of international adoption was really the war. So the Vietnam War, which Steve was part of for Operation Baby Lift, and then the Korean War for South Korea. And China is quite different in the sense that really what drove a lot of international adoption was a government decision for like the one child policy. And so you personally have seen that, kind of how that has played out in your personal life and your biological family. And so it's, you know, all of these additional factors. And I think as adoptees, when we often navigate and think about our adoption, it can just be kind of in isolation to what our individual journey is. But I feel like it's helpful to kind of, you know, give grace to all the people who are involved and recognizing that there's like so many geopolitics that are also involved, you know, timeframes and timelines that are far outside of the control of obviously ourselves being infants and adoptees, but also, you know, our birth families and, you know, even our adopted families and kind of their understanding of what is happening. So I also wanted to give a chance. So Nora had submitted a series of questions. I see that she's on, so I wanted to give you also the option if you would like to ask your question live, or if you would like me to choose, just because you had asked a number. So I just wanted either for you to choose which question to ask and ask live, or I can choose one of them. So I leave it to you, Nora.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah and Charlotte. I guess my most important question just at this moment, I really enjoyed your comments. Thanks, Charlotte. Is just this idea when you did have the opportunity to reunite, how that felt for you and how you thought the family reacted to you being part of them. What was that aspect like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Sorry, could you repeat the first part of it? Sorry, and it was such a good question.
Sure. Just when you did have the opportunity to reunite, and I think you said was in person.
Right.
How did you feel that they reacted to meeting you and their thoughts around you being part of them?
Yes. Okay, that's a good question. So yeah, I was lucky. So again, the impetus for the searching initially was that I was going to be there in the summer. Excuse me. on the ground in mainland China that summer before I was going to study abroad in the fall. So I was able to meet them. In fact, because the search happened sort of before I went, when I was there, I was able to sort of spend the entire week with them, which was really nice. And, you know, I had the very fortunate to have had the luxury to do that. In terms of how it went, I mean, one thing that I'll say is that at this time the media was also still with us, so it was a little bit crazy. I wish I had the video. Maybe I'll share it on the Discord channel later. But there was a video of when I came, they were waiting for me at the airport because we flew in. We went to my friend's from Western China. She's from Xinjiang. So we were there first, and then we flew back east for the second half, excuse me, for my half of the half of the searching trip. And so they were waiting for me at the airport. But it was also really crazy because so were like 20 other people with cameras. So it was like kind of I wouldn't say it was necessarily positive, to be honest, because there was just like so much craziness going on at that point. And I think that's like part of the thing that I would say like that I didn't love working with the media on is that it's just so overwhelming, and you're trying to have, you know, what is, you know, such a personal and, you know, intimate moment, but then suddenly there are like also like cameras around. But, you know, I mean, you know, I think the retort to that will be, well, you invited them. And I think, I mean, yeah, that's fair enough. And I think, you know, I think it is a little bit of a, for me, it was a necessary evil just because I didn't have any information at all. So, you know, inviting them kind of in, you know, obviously I had things that I wanted to accomplish. They had their own agendas. And so it was something that I was willing to kind of make a little bit of like adjustments on and kind of like you know, it's not ideal, but like you know, I was willing to live with some of the disadvantages for some of it. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, working with media, you do lose a lot of the control over your narrative, and also, right, you kind of have like a lot of invasive sort of spotlight on what is kind of a personal you know, moment. But yeah, meeting them, you know, I think honestly they were more surprised than anything else, because they didn't even know that I had ended up in America. That like had never even crossed their mind. So I think they had thought that anyway, the story that they had said, that they told me later, was that they thought they were giving me away to another couple, sort of like a couple, like a childless couple, a military couple with a lot of money, that they were doing some kind of like handoff through a third party so that the adopting family, so that they wouldn't know who the adopting family were. So like, because I think like whatever it is, like they were saying like the family that raises the kid doesn't want the biological parent to then come back and like take the kid like when like later on. So that way, anyway, that was what they were told. So whether or not that story is true, I have no idea. Or maybe it was a story told to them by relatives. Maybe it was like a scam or something. I have no idea, and I don't think I probably will ever know what the truth is. And that's the other interesting thing about finding them is, you know, I feel like I thought I was going to get all these answers, but I think a lot of it, like I mentioned before, was like, you know, it sort of opened as many questions as it answered for me. But so anyway, so they thought I was just being raised by, you know, another couple, you know, a couple of towns over in China. And then so they didn't know that first of all that I had gone to a social welfare institute, and second of all, they didn't know that I had been adopted abroad. So when the reporter first said, oh, she's in America, they said, well, she's studying abroad, because they thought I had been raised in China. And so I think, you know, it definitely was a weird, I'm not going to say, I think what Leah said before about kind of like these Hollywood narratives is a good point, because I think a lot of people are like picturing these things where like, you know, there are rainbows and unicorns and whatnot, and people are like really happy to reunite. But I think reunion can be kind of an awkward affair, and you know, you're meeting these people for the first time. And so it took a little bit to get used to. And I think they were happy, but they were surprised. I think the siblings, to be honest, were, especially the older sisters, were a little bit wary, especially because I had come with so much media attention. They were like, well, you know, like, what do you want from us? And like, why are you kind of dragging us like through the spotlight, which honestly wasn't my intent. It was just sort of like the way that I happened to go about it. But I think, yeah, I think it is interesting sort of like what the like kind of response. I think it's going to be different for each adoptee if they, you know, if you end up finding something kind of, it's so crazy because you never know what you're going to find, and like and sort of like how they're going to how that reception is going to be. But for me, I did end up, so I did have that week where it was like the media was following us everywhere, but then I ended up going back a couple of weeks later just by myself, and spending some time at their family home, and that was a lot nicer, to be honest. And sort of just getting to know them like one-on-one. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I think from there it would just sort of was just like any relationship that you kind of have to build, you kind of have to learn a little bit about the other person, the person has to learn about you. Obviously there's going to be and maybe the rest of the other panelists will sort of touch on that a little bit, some like cultural and language sort of differences that make it more challenging than like a normal beginning relationship will be. But in general, they, if I had to say in one word, they were happy to see me, I guess.
I think, Charlotte, that's like, I'm conscious of also you and so being
Sorry, I know I am taking up all the time. I definitely want to get to Daniel and Steve as well, so I hope that they have time.
I think that you raised such an important point, though, which is, when you're, whether it's social media or journalists or media at large, there are important trade-offs to consider. And one of those trade-offs is your privacy, right? And I think people can be surprised, in realizing, when they're in the middle of it, how suddenly their very personal journey and story is now up for public consumption. And that can be like a really intrusive experience. And so, I mean, I would say personally, even for myself, like I really have not spoken at all, even though I've been really involved in the adoptee community, but I have really not spoken at all about like my personal adoptee journey and experience, because I would rather not, like, the media, as you said, present whatever kind of narrative that they want in their own light. And I think that that's always helpful to consider as well, right? Because of your, your process as far as doing a birth search, which is different from Dan and Steve, who they'll be able to share. But by using social media and or journalists, which was kind of a necessity given, what you had available to you, it did lend itself to a very different kind of experience and having a very much more public experience for your birth search and reunion experience. And I feel like that's an important variable for adoptees to consider if they do pursue that. It is still like, I think it's still, it's great that it is even an option, but I feel like it's helpful to consider that at the beginning, kind of to brace yourself personally and emotionally for what that journey can be. But Charlotte, I did want to say thank you so much. I also wanted to, have Steve and Dan have a chance to share as well, and give you a chance to rest up, feel better. Certainly feel free to stay. As Charlotte had mentioned, we do have a Discord community. Charlotte has very generously said that she's happy to answer additional questions that folks might have, so we can continue the conversation over there. But for today, we'll let you kind of have a whole bunch of soup, drink lots of fluids, get lots of rest, and feel better soon.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much. It's been great. And thank you so much to Leah and to the rest of the panelists as well. Thank you.
Do we want to take a group photo before Charlotte leaves, or?
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Shelley. It's a really great point. Well, thank you so much again, Charlotte. We really appreciate it. And again, wishing you a speedy recovery. Hope you certainly feel better soon. And so to that, I did want to give, so for maybe Dan, would you be able to kind of share a little bit about a bit of a bio about yourself, who you are, and then Steve, if you can also get ready, and we'll kind of dive into your portion of the panel next.
Yeah, I'm Dan. I'm from Michigan, adopted from Seoul, Korea in '91 as an infant. Really just started thinking about my adoption in earnest, maybe the last 2.5 years or so, largely prompted by the birth of my son, and thinking like, gosh, I got to get a handle on this if I'm going to help him get a handle on it. So yeah, I started with that, and then during sort of a frenzied night, decided, I'm getting older. My paperwork tells me that my birth mother is, 22 years older than me, and I need to sort of get a move on this and think about what it looks like if I want to try to find her. So I went through. Korea has a fairly standardized process right now, at least, of contacting your Korean agency, and then they forward it on to the National Center for the Rights of the Child. And then if they have an address on file based on your paperwork, they'll, send letters, try to contact them. And so over the course of really just 2 months, I reached out to them. They reached out to my birth mother, who they were able to locate. And now we talk regularly. And so it's been sort of a whirlwind. I've been in reunion for just about 7 months now. And so navigating all of the highs and lows that come along with that. A lot of lows, actually, sort of counter to the narrative that I had believed of, reunion as the sort of last bastion of adoptee accomplishment, and everything will be sunshine and roses from now on. And have joined groups to support being in reunion, and have connected with other adoptees in reunion and other Korean adoptees specifically, who share a similar experience, which has been really, really energizing and really fantastic. So really excited to be here and share a little bit about myself.
Thank you so much, Dan. We're happy to have you. And as mentioned, Dan's we consider an honorary Canadian. He had joined us for one of our in-person events the end of last year. Steve, would you like to share a little bit about kind of your story and anything else?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Leah. So yeah, I was adopted at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. Originally, my parents, going through the adoption process probably took a few years. They thought I was on that C5A crash that happened. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the history. There was a crash that happened on April 4th of 1975. So they got the news, after, navigating this process, that I was on that plane and that I was no longer coming to Canada. So they were obviously devastated. And then April 28th, my mom got a call and I was in San Francisco. So, back at that time, no cell phones, no ATMs. My dad was in court, so she had to, I'm the youngest of 4 siblings. So I have one sibling who's 2 years older, and then my twin sisters are 5 years older. So at the time, my mom would have had to, get babysitting or get a friend to take care of my siblings. And she jumped on a plane, flew down to San Francisco, and arrived back in Vancouver before my dad got out of court. So my dad went right to the airport. So yeah, very different sort of situation in terms of the urgency of getting kids out of Vietnam at the end of the war. And through sort of these podcasts and this adoption community, I have been in touch with one of the missionaries who was responsible for getting, I'll go back. I was one of 4 kids on the last commercial flight, Pan Am flight out of Vietnam. And yeah, through this sort of adoption network, I was able to talk to the missionary who's responsible for getting the 4 kids on that plane out of Saigon. And he actually sent us this document. It's about 6 or 7 pages of the account of the last few days and all the logistics that went into it. It's pretty amazing because we did have a stopover, I think, in Hawaii. And if the people working immigration actually looked at the documentation and looked at the babies, they would have rejected us because that documentation was not for us. And that's sort of a common theme for the end of the Vietnam War, is like everyone has different birth dates, different documents, but they were just trying to get kids out of the country. And then one last thing is, again, through this amazing community, I was on a call. Leah mentioned that I may go to that 50-year Operation Baby Lift reunion. I did actually meet one of the 4 other babies who are adopted, and she's in the States, so we've been in touch. So it's been pretty incredible. The last few years, like I said, like Leah mentioned, growing up, my mom did a lot of volunteer work with adoption and founded this Adoptive Families Association of BC. So she did a lot of work helping navigate the adoption process for prospective adoptive parents. So yeah, she did that for a year. So I sat on panels, you know, quite a bit, sort of through high school and my early days of university. And then I did go to Vietnam in 1997 with my adoptive parents. And at that time, we went to the orphanage where I was, which was really cool. And that was all set up. And then recently in 2023, I also took my family over to Vietnam, and we went to the orphanage. Well, we didn't have it set up like before, but yeah, it was great to go to the orphanage. And then sort of through the translation, I realized that there was, or we made the connection that there was a sister or nun there back in 1975 when I was there. Leah, do you want me to go into my just an overview of my birth search now, or should I leave that?
Well, actually, I feel like that might tie into the next question. So one of the questions that was submitted was, you know, how did you know that you wanted to do a birth search? What was like the initial seed? Dan, you mentioned it briefly, obviously with, you know, the birth of your son, but also, you know, do you feel like you had realistic expectations for your search? And importantly, you know, what advice would you give to somebody who is, you know, considering doing a birth search? So a multi-layered, kind of pinned question, but would love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so growing up, my mom, because she was so involved in adoption, she really encouraged, you know, to try to find that history or any background. But being, you know, sort of just the age gap, like I'm quite a bit older than the other two panelists. There wasn't DNA, there wasn't social media, that didn't exist. So, but I was much in contact with one of the sisters, Rosemary Taylor, and she was a big sort of figure in adoption. She was an Australian nun, and she helped, you know, probably thousands of kids get adopted out of Vietnam. And because my mom was so involved, we corresponded back and forth. And that actually, when I went to Vietnam in 1997, I also did like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. I missed her in Bangkok by a week. But even before I went, she basically said it's a needle in it. And again, before DNA, it's a needle in a haystack. It was so chaotic at the end of the war. The chances of you finding a birth family are very slim. So yeah, and I'll sort of go on to my search, but maybe I'll let Daniel speak to his sort of the incentive in terms of starting that search.
Yeah, I think much younger in a much different situation. I think for me, as I mentioned my son, but I think honestly the original seed of the thought was my at the time wife had gotten me a DNA test for a birthday before I had started engaging with any of my adopteeness or anything like that. And I think originally the thought had been to just figure out, you know, am I actually Korean? Because I didn't know until that point. And then sort of once those results came back, you know, I noticed the little tab of, you know, DNA relatives or ancestry. And that was sort of the first time that I ever, I think, thought about like, gosh, there are people out there that are related to me. And I had been maybe sort of in denial about that before, or just hadn't been ready to engage with it. And I think that was sort of the origin of it.
Yeah, and I think what's really, you know, helpful for people to consider and recognize is that, you know, all of us come to this journey as adoptees, you know, at different stages and through different processes. And a lot of adoptees also never even consider or are interested in a birth search. And I think it's helpful and important to know that there's no like right answer, right? You are no more or less an adoptee or Vietnamese or Chinese or Korean if you do a birth search or if you don't do a birth search, or if you go to the homeland or you don't pursue going to doing a homeland trip. And I feel like it's what's really important, right? Whether it's somebody happening to give you a DNA kit and then just planting that seed, or whether it's something else like a big anniversary for an event within your country. There's no like right answer or no requirement, you know, as an adoptee. And I feel like, you know, kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, often the Hollywood narrative can be like, it has to be this structure and this process, like a linear process that you check off along the way. And, you know, I feel like what's really important, even in the, you know, stories that we've shared today, to see just the range and diversity of our journey to either decide or not to decide to do a birth search, and then what that search and how that can unfold. So to that, you know, maybe Steve, do you want to kind of share more about what you were going to talk about for your search?
Sure, yeah, and my birth search story, I'm assuming, is quite different from others. So it was actually my sister one of my sisters who got the ancestry test to do it. She was just interested in, you know, sort of genetics. She did her degree in biology and genetics and family trees. So she said she ordered a second kit, an extra kit by mistake. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyways, I got the kit. This was before COVID. I brought it home. It probably sat on my dresser for months. I finally did it. And at that time, it took a couple weeks. And I got some really remote connections, like fifth cousin, sixth cousin, eighth cousin. I messaged a couple people on Ancestry, didn't get much back. And then a few years ago, I was sitting here, actually exactly where I am today, just doing work. It was you know, sort of after COVID, and I get a message on Facebook. It says, "Hello, my name is Chris. This is going to be weird, but I just did a DNA test through Ancestry. It says you're my dad." And I was like, "What? How can this be possible?" And all I texted back, and I often read back the messages on Facebook, the sort of the thread. All I said is, "How old are you?" And at the time he said, "I'm 27." And I'm like, "I don't know what to say. Can I call you? This has to be a mistake." And he's like, "Well, you can't call me because I just got married. I'm down in Brazil. My wife's Brazilian, and we just had a kid, and we're introducing our son to her family." I'm like, "Okay, well, can we do a Facebook message, a messenger?" So within 10 minutes, I'm talking to this guy. I still have no idea what's going on. He says that he did the test, 50% father. I'm like, "I think this is a mistake." And it's kind of bad, but my first sort of intuition is like, has to be some kind of scam. But then all of a sudden he says, "Well, you're not the only person I'm matched to." And he said the name of one of my ex-girlfriend's parents. And then right then I was like, "Oh, okay, I gotta call you back. I gotta look into this." So I'm friends with my ex-girlfriend. This is back from like end of high school, university. And I just messaged her saying, "Hey, can you call me? It's important." We have this conversation. I said, "Hey, this is going to sound really weird, but I've got this kid down in Brazil. He claims I'm his dad, and for whatever reason, your parents are in Ancestry, and he also matched to them." And I'm like, "Did you have a kid without telling me?" And it's kind of obviously a weird question to ask. And at that time, she said no. I'm like, "Okay, well, I don't know. Thanks, great chatting with you," or not great chatting with you, but I guess I better tell this kid that I talked to you. And she said no. So I messaged him back on Messenger saying, "Sorry, I don't know what to tell you, but I think the DNA is wrong." And he's like, "Well, the DNA is the DNA." I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, man. This is my ex-girlfriend. I haven't talked to her in several years, but this is what she said. Half an hour later, she calls back. She's in tears. Right after we broke up, she went out on a date, was sexually assaulted, went through with the pregnancy, didn't tell anyone, didn't tell her parents, didn't tell her current husband, didn't tell anyone. So after 27 years, she's getting this call from her ex-boyfriend from high school and university saying, "I've got this kid on the line." So it's a crazy story. A bunch of things sort of happened after that, but now I met him and his wife a couple times. And the crazy thing is, like, we were both on the mainland in Vancouver, but he was adopted to Victoria, where I live and grew up. So he grew up in the same town as I did. So I could have run into him, in the mall or on the street. And it's been so interesting because within 24 hours of him getting his results. And because one of the things with him growing up is he never knew his genetic background. So his identity was not knowing his identity. He was raised as an only child here in Victoria, but never knew the background because my ex-girlfriend gave fake information at the hospital. So he could never track anything down. So once he had his kid, kind of same thing as Daniel, once he had a kid, he's like, "Well, I kind of want to try to solve this mystery for my son so I can tell him what the story was." So yeah, it's been an incredible couple years. They just had another kid, a little girl in the last month or so. And it's interesting because, like I said, his wife's Brazilian, and Jaden, the first little grandson, looks more sort of Brazilian or Caucasian, but their daughter definitely looks like Vietnamese, has like the big thick black hair. So yeah, it's an incredible sort of transition, of course, I have two kids, grade 10 and grade 12, but 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, sort of breaking this news to them, and of course my siblings. So my birth search story is completely different, but very, very interesting. And so they moved to Edmonton, which is about an hour and a half flight, for those who don't know, from Vancouver or Victoria. So I went and saw them a couple months ago before the birth of their second kid, but we're hoping to see them this summer. I think they're going to fly out to Victoria because my son was raised in Victoria. They still have lots of family and friends out here. So that's my birth story. Quite different from what I'd expected when I initially saw that first message on Facebook. But yeah, it's been really interesting. And of course, for my son who was adopted, when he did the DNA test and when he talked to me, to realize that I was adopted, and the only reason I did the ancestry test was to try and birth parents, it just blew his mind. So it's been great, and it's been great to sort of learn, or getting to know this young family, and that I'm a grandpa, which is still kind of baffling when I think about it.
No, Steve, thank you so much for sharing. And I think it's such a valuable perspective, not only like as an adoptee, but as a birth parent, like as a birth father, and
Yeah.
what it can feel like and what that story is for for stories that some of us will never know, right? And all of the different kind of things that unfolded that you didn't know initially either, as far as that you were a birth father and how
Yeah.
that was, and your journey in trying to uncover and peel away all the layers for what that history was and who you were in your role within it, because you had known for like decades. And so I think it's helpful for us to hear as adoptees, and knowing, when we're doing our birth search, we come at it from our perspective and the lives that we have, and hoping that there's, an understanding on the other side, but possibly, maybe our birth family, or certain members of our birth family anyways, don't even know that we exist. And I think that's a really important part to consider as well.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, just navigating that my ex-girlfriend had this secret,
Yeah.
like, inside for 27 years. That must have been just insane to sort of let out, and all that. Like, she probably never expected this call,
Yeah.
right? Because she thought it was the result of this sexual assault. So yeah, so many things to still unpack.
And also how technology has truly transformed what birth search can look like. Technology, social media, the connectivity
Yeah.
of today, it's just totally transformed it. And Dan, I would love to hear from you as far as what advice would you give someone who is contemplating doing a birth search, right? Who might be kind of on the fence, at the beginning stages, say when you were just out of curiosity. What advice would you give them?
I think I thought about this because it felt like the most likely question to come up. And I really struggled with it. And I think giving yourself time and spaciousness. I think largely because mine went so quickly, I didn't get much of a chance, and I feel like I've been playing catch up since then. And it's been a lot of therapy and various different kinds, and a lot of reading and a lot of connecting with people to try to even figure out where I'm at with this. And kind of to go back to Kyung Mi's question from earlier, it's been a lot of frustration, honestly, to see, along with that reading, to see the sort of the political machinations that make up adoption. It starts to feel like, my birth family, my adoptive family were sort of led by the hand towards relinquishment and adoption of me. And honestly, it makes it hard to be angry sometimes. And I find times when I would just like to be able to blame someone, and it's tough to blame a system. And so, yeah, it makes it tough to even find out more information sometimes, because it feels like it puts me in a more difficult place. But yeah, taking the time, whatever that means for you, I think to learn how you need to, or to connect with people in a similar spot to you, has been really helpful. And also to connect with people like you, Leah, or there's a few people on this call who've been at this for years and years and years, has been really meaningful, and really helped a lot to get some perspective. Because even some of the folks that I meet now who have been in reunion for 10, 15 years, some people who I would consider good friends now, it's funny to hear them say, oh, like, I remember going through that, or funny to see this phase again. And it's like, okay, this is the step along the path, and it is headed somewhere. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so important, right? Like how time is such an important factor for, digesting, navigating and kind of exploring this. And then also, as you mentioned, our individual adoptions all happen within a much larger system, right? What for countries, international geopolitics, for wars. And I think that's really important to consider as well, is that we don't happen in like a vacuum in isolation, but all the additional forces that are a part of it. And so another question that was submitted is, with regards to returning to the homeland, do you think it's important to visit your homeland first on a separate search or on a separate visit independent of your search? I'm not sure if the person who asked that question is here, but that's a question. Either of you folks have thoughts about that?
I'll go. I guess I don't get that opportunity now. I'm a little too late, I think. I've had similar thoughts though, where it's going to be tough, where, I'm going back in October to meet my mother for the first time. And separate from that, I'm also returning to Korea for the first time. And so it started to feel when I was planning it, like no amount of time is going to be spacious enough for all of this. Like no matter what, this is going to be tough. So thankful that I'm going with some adoptee friends who have some context in birth search and reunion, but expecting sort of a heck of a ride. My mother works at a restaurant and has said that, we'll hang out in the evenings and on the weekends. And during the day, I'll be, I guess, exploring Korea. And I just keep finding more things that I want to do, both the reunion part of me and also just the returning to Korea part of me. And so it feels like a lot. And so I think given the opportunity, I definitely would have gone to Korea prior to being in reunion or prior to a birth search to hopefully tidy up some of those pieces that, I'm going to have to do all at once now. And it feels like too much.
Steve.
Yeah, no, I think it was like, well, I went back, like I said, during university the first time to Vietnam, and it was incredible. So I was in Southeast Asia for 4 months, and then my adopted parents came over and met us in Vietnam, and we all had like 1 month visas. So we kind of traveled throughout the country, but not every stop together. But it was just so incredible. And then I would have been sort of like mid-20s at the time. And I don't know at that time if I was going to meet, if I had, found my birth parents, how that would have been. I think it was just overwhelming enough to just go back to your country of origin, and it was amazing. And then just the experience to take my kids back to Vietnam in 2023 for the first time, that was amazing to sort of show them the piece of the culture, and it was an amazing trip. We were there for 3 weeks. But I definitely want to go back and live there, like after retirement, or go live there for 3 or 4 months and just do the day-to-day stuff. So, but yeah, I think it would be different, like Daniel mentioned, like doing both at the same time, because you're going to, if you haven't been to the country, there's just that culture shock. But to sort of layer on, you're meeting your birth family, it's definitely a lot.
Yeah, I think I think that's part of the challenge though of being international adoptees, is that going back to the homeland isn't like a half-an-hour drive, right? It's not
No.
for either time commitment or financial investment either. So when we go back, you can often feel like, like you mentioned, Steve, like really wanting to stay there for a substantial amount of time, right? And then, kind of Dan, as you mentioned, like processing all of the things, right, for learning about and being in the homeland, and that in and of itself is such a unique experience, let alone layering and doing a birth search. And I think, Steve, you had mentioned a really important variable as well, as far as kind of, life phase, right? Whether you're going to the homeland by yourself or you're going with your family.
Yeah.
Family, maybe if you're married, or if you bring your adopted family, whatever your family might look like. There are like lots of different ways that this can kind of unfold, and what a return to the homeland can look like. And I think it's helpful to also recognize, right? Like often within the Hollywood narrative, it's just the singular story of like this adoptee going to the homeland, maybe to do a birth search, and usually that's it. it's rarely involving the layered experience of, say, being a parent like Steve and bringing your children and sharing your birth culture with your children, or other narratives that come with it. So I think it's really helpful to, to be fair to yourself and recognize that, as an adoptee, your experience as an adoptee continues to evolve and grow and change. And, regardless of how long you have been in the community, I've been in the community for 2 decades, and it continues to change and evolve. And I think it's helpful for adoptees to know and be fair to yourself and give yourself the time that you need and want to process and kind of digest all of these experiences that can come along with it. Another question that was submitted online was a question that I think is so important, because we are international adoptees and because language is a factor for all of us, for most of us anyways, is, what language barriers did you face or have you possibly faced, and how did you, handle them, navigate them, either, in your return trip to the homeland or in communicating with your birth family?
I'll just mention in my last trip, and actually the one years ago in 1997, just because of the sort of French colonialism in Vietnam, there's a certain age or generation where I could speak French. And when we went back this time, it was actually my daughter, who's been in French immersion, she's in grade 12 now, who talked to the nun. So there was a little bit lost in translation, but most of the communication was between my daughter and this nun who was there in 1975 when I was there. So that helped.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add that AI has been bittersweet, I think, in AI translation and translation tools. In that I was trying pretty hard to learn Korean, and then when I did reconnect with my birth mother, it was actually the translation made it more difficult to try to learn Korean because I could manage with the tools that I had, and it's a little difficult because our conversations don't get that deep, because I frequently find myself afraid to try to broach deeper topics or more emotional topics because I feel like the translation doesn't do as good of a job. So I could certainly hire someone, but money's always a concern. And also it just feels odd to have to have a third person to talk to my mother. So yeah, it works and it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think there's different nuances that come with translation. I'm hopeful that AI will one day be good enough we can just use a computer, like be able to cut out all those middle people. We'll see though. The syntax for our languages are very different. So this is some of the questions that were asked in the chat here. One question was, well, I think this was answered, but maybe folks can kind of dive into this further, is, what kind of documents, this is more logistics, did you use or helped you in your search for, your reunion journey? Do you use any documents, and what were those documents?
I just did the DNA. And I just saw Suki's message in the chat there. Just for clarification, I haven't found my birth parents. It was just my son who I found I had, and it was only a year and a half ago.
Oh, and for myself, it was really just the piece of paper that sort of clarified which adoption agency I was adopted through. Prior to my stateside agency closing, I had requested stuff from them, but it was really just copies of what I already had. And so, yeah, I contacted my Korean agency. They asked for my passport, and then that was really it.
Yeah, and I think kind of to go back also to, the initial part of our conversation with Charlotte, I think sometimes the assumption can be that if your adoption records aren't entirely accurate, that you will be unable to do a birth search if you're interested in. But I feel that across all of these different experiences shared, you don't have to rely on your adoption records. You can, but it's not a necessity. Whether it's DNA testing or whether it's using social media or local journalists, there are a number of different tools that you can use. Myself and Dan, we both used our documents and were able to reach back out to our adoption agencies, but it's not required. And I think that's helpful to know if you're wondering, the validity or the accuracy of whatever is in your documents. It's really helpful to understand. And what would you say as far as maybe this is kind of an interesting point for where you're both at in having returned or planning to return to the homeland? What would be advice that you would give to anybody who's planning to return to the homeland, both as somebody who has been back to your homeland and somebody who is planning to go later this year?
I would just say, just take the time to take it all in, because usually it's so different from the life you're living now, and just like soak up the culture, the food, get ready for things like, it's kind of like, different travel, but like you can't be too hardwired for like sort of expectations and how things run. Just sort of be relaxed and let things go the way they go, right? Or else you're going to be super stressed out, right? Because especially in 1997, like a lot of times I never knew where I was sleeping that night. You sort of get into a town on the train at 2 a.m. and someone comes in a Ciclo and they take you to a guest house. And of course it's different, in 2023, but things happen all the time and that go wrong, and just kind of roll with it. If you're that kind of person who can, that's my suggestion. I think you'll enjoy it more. And of course, different expectations, right? Just kind of be open to different things happening, and don't be too hard on yourself in terms of like what you expect, or disappointment if you didn't think it's going to be like this. Just keep your eyes open and learn, and the sights and sounds and smells is so amazing. That's what I found.
I think I'm encouraged to hear that I'm abiding by Steve's advice. And I pretty much have a plane ticket, and my mother has said that we'll book a hotel in July. And that's it. I'll show up and I can read, not translate. I can read Korean well enough to get where I need to go, I think. And from there, I'll just kind of see what happens. I have loose plans to try to visit the small island where she grew up, but outside of that, I'll do whatever she wants to do, or I'll kind of do wherever Korea takes me is where I'll end up.
And maybe what has been kind of the most surprising thing for yourself as you've been in this adoptee journey? When you think about, the Steve or the Dan of you when you first started exploring this versus where you are today, what has been surprising to you, and learning maybe more about yourself, or about your family, about your place, your identity? What's that been like for you?
Well, for me,
sure.
or
Oh,
go ahead.
No, go Steve.
Well, obviously, for me, that I had a son I never knew about, which is kind of quite a shocker, right? But that, and just kind of, in a way, how easy it's been sort of getting to, his name's Chris, getting to know Chris and his wife and the 2 kids. They are in Edmonton, so there's a lot of, sort of social media posts and stuff. But yeah, it's been so interesting. And I got to meet his adoptive parents. Actually, when I went to Edmonton, just the way the logistics worked is his dad picked me up from the airport. We had never met before, but it seemed very natural. And just, it was interesting to hear their sort of story, and how he was raised, and sort of what he was like growing up as a single child. He always wanted siblings. So my ex has 4 kids and I have 2. So that, just this whole journey moving forward together, and how, like, in a way, how absurd it is, but also how kind of like natural we've all sort of been able to come together.
And I think for me, it's been finding that a lot of the, I guess, mental health or personality issues that I've sort of been contending with my whole life, that I haven't loved about myself, how healing it's been to sort of confront those with my birth mother, who it feels like they sort of, I don't know, take root in and stem from. For example, I'm a people pleaser. I have a tough time saying no to people, and so working through in therapy to tell her no, that there are things that I'm not able to do. I'm not able to bring my son on this trip. I'm sorry, you won't meet your grandson. Or to confront some of these things that have been really tough for me throughout my life with the person that it feels like they sort of come from, has been actually really healing. And yeah, I feel like it has put me in a really good place. So one positive. And then I did want to just say Abby's question I'm seeing for the homeland travel. I think because of Korea and the US's relationship specifically, I don't need anything particular, but I think I am entitled to reclaim my Korean citizenship, which I will do, but haven't yet.
So I am conscious of the time here. I did want to say thank you so much. You know, Steve, Dan, for your time, Charlotte as well. If you watch this recording, you know, so appreciated your insights shared. And, you know, we will kind of, as mentioned by Charlotte earlier, we'll be continuing this conversation on our Discord. You're certainly welcome to join. We have some different chats available for folks, and it's an opportunity for people to, because I saw there are some questions for Charlotte that we weren't able to get to before she had to rest. So people are welcome to continue the conversation on Discord. And as far as for today, I really hope that, I really hope that everybody enjoyed this opportunity to be able to kind of connect, hear from very different experiences and stories. You know, all like Charlotte, Steve, and Dan were able to share such a full range of different perspectives, and truly, I think, highlight even just in their three stories, the incredible diversity that we have for all of our lives, and what they actually look like. And I think that's, you know, so important as far as for, you know, the narrative that we are often told, as far as kind of, as I've mentioned, you know, by Hollywood, for being like a singular story that we must follow. And I hope that today you've really seen just the wide range and variety that there actually is for all of us. And it gives you the flexibility to know that, and permission, that there is no one pathway that's like right or correct, but you can really carve out whatever story that you want. And it is just as right and just as good as anybody else. So with that, thank you again on behalf of the Asian Adoptees of Canada for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to continuing to be in touch. You can keep an eye out for some of the other events that we will have later this year, both online and in person. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Leah.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks, Leah.